Hi everyone, welcome to the CJS Thursday lecture series. I am Nuan Xiang. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science. I study the politics of public health interventions in Japan from a comparative perspective. I will help host coordinate today's lecture. So before, we have several announcements. First, next Thursday, on November 4th, our guest speaker will be Annie Claude. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. The lecture title is Drawing the Sea Near, Sato Umi and Coral Reef Conservation in Okinawa. The lecture will start at our usual time at noon. In today's lecture, attendees' webcam and microphones have been muted, but we invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit any questions you have, and the presenter will try to address as many questions as possible after the main lecture, although she won't take questions during the lecture. And we also want to thank the Waseda Center for Emerging Democracies for co-sponsoring this talk as part of their Capitalism and the Democracy series. And finally, I want to thank CJS staff Barbara Kender, Robin Grave, Julian Locke, and Yuri Kuzawa for running the lecture series smoothly and make all things possible. Okay, let's turn to today's lecture. Our speaker today is Professor Yeonju Lee. She is an assistant professor at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study at Waseda University. She is also affiliated with the Weatherhead Research Cluster on Comparative Inequality and Inclusion at Howard University. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Howard University. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School. Her current book project, Judging Inequality, explain how people define and judge economic inequality through the lens of the sense of injustice and the mechanism through which inequality judgment shapes the political arena, such as the politics of redistribution, political polarization, and democratic discontent. I think today's lecture is also based on this book project. So this work is based on her dissertation, which was awarded the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group Dissertation Prize by the Center for Economic of Human Development at the Department of Economics, University of Chicago. She is the first non-economics PhD to win the prize. Her research has been supported by the Japanese Ministry of Education and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, among many others. Okay, I will stop talking and let's welcome Professor Lee to deliver the lecture.
Good evening. Thank you for taking the time to come to my presentation this evening. And I would also like to thank the CJS and also the Weiser Center for this wonderful opportunity to share my research with you. So the title of my presentation today is Judging Inequality, Japan in Comparative Perspective. And I've been working on this book project for the past several years that compares how people judge income inequality in 4 advanced democracies, Japan, Korea, France, and the United States. And I'll present some parts of the research. And to disappoint some of you who are here because you want to know more about inequality in Japan, the presentation is really a comparative one rather than just focusing on Japan, but it will be interesting to think about how and why Japanese people think and behave this way in comparison to other countries. So let me begin by introducing the motivating puzzle for this project. So income inequality has dominated media headlines and political and policy debates in many countries. And there's also extensive literature in academia, especially in social sciences, that examine the effect of economic inequality on various political outcomes. In particular, political attitudes and behavior. For example, studies find that when income inequality increases, people are more likely to support redistribution, vote for a liberal party, and support democracy. However, these studies do not explain the mechanisms of how economic inequality shapes political attitudes and behavior. Instead, they build their arguments based on an assumption that actual income inequality and how people perceive inequality are in tandem. So in other words, in countries with high levels of income inequality, people should also perceive that income inequality is high in their countries. So according to this assumption, if we were to plot income inequality on the x-axis and perception of inequality on the y-axis, so we should see this increasing line as perception of income inequality increase with actual income inequality. However, actual income inequality and how people perceive inequality are not always closely correlated, as you can see in this plot. So we see an almost flat line here, which indicates that there's no statistically or substantively meaningful relationship between actual income inequality and how people perceive inequality. So even when a country has a high level of income inequality, this does not mean that people also perceive high income inequality in their countries. So in this sample of 37 democracies, income inequality in Japan is slightly below the mean and well below the median. And South Korea has much lower income inequality than Japan, yet perception of inequality is much higher in Korea than Japan. And France and United States have similar levels of actual income inequality. However, again, people in France seem to perceive much higher income inequality than those in the United States. And there is a newly developing literature, mostly in economics, on this mismatch between actual income inequality and how people perceive income inequality. So these studies show that individuals do not know where they stand in the distribution of income, to which income group they belong, and how large differences are between high-paying jobs and low-paying jobs, and what the distribution of income and wealth look like. So when actual income inequality and how people perceive inequality decouple, it may be misleading to explain people's political attitudes and behavior directly with actual income inequality. So then the question is, when does income inequality become salient to have a meaningful effect on political attitudes and behavior? What are the possible mechanisms? And I argue that one possible mechanism is how people judge income inequality. So my book project, Judging Inequality, A Sense of Injustice, Inequality Perceptions in Politics. So my book explains how people judge income inequality and its political implications. So the first part develops a theory of inequality judgment, and I argue that a sense of injustice leads people to judge income inequality in particular ways, and the historical experience of inequality and injustice shape what kind of injustice becomes salient and the degree of sensitivity to injustice and inequality in a later period. And the second part takes income inequality judgment to address three important puzzles in political science. So first, why democratic discontent is stronger in some countries than others. Second, why people's support for redistribution does not increase with actual income inequality. And third, what explains people's voting behavior. And today I will present some segments of the project. So first, the relationship between a sense of injustice and inequality judgment, and inequality judgment and preferences for redistribution. In particular, the presentation will focus on the following question. So first, what is inequality judgment? Second, how do people define income inequality? Third, when do people judge income differences to be too high and unacceptable? And fourth, does support for redistribution increase with inequality judgment? So the first question, what is inequality judgment? Income inequality can be observed on two dimensions: objective measures such as Thiel's index or Gini coefficient, and subjective dimension, which is inequality perceptions. And people can perceive income inequality in different ways. However, existing literature on inequality perceptions do not define what inequality perceptions are, and they assume that the term is monolithic. So they only focus on whether or not people can accurately estimate the extent of income inequality, which I call inequality estimation. However, I distinguish between inequality estimation and inequality judgment. So attitudinal or normative interpretation is a key trait of inequality judgment. So people may directly judge income inequality or first estimate, then judge income inequality. And inequality judgment is what matters for political attitudes and behavior. So more specifically, to estimate inequality is to roughly calculate the value or extent of the actual income differences. And it is about how accurately or inaccurately people estimate income inequality. So it's a factual assessment. On the other hand, to judge income inequality is to interpret income inequality and form certain attitudes toward inequality based on embedded norms. And it is a normative assessment in which you judge whether income inequality is good or bad, or acceptable or unacceptable. And to understand thought process behind people's estimation and judgment of income inequality, I conducted interviews and also included open-ended survey questions. And when people were asked with questions that measure estimated inequality, you can see that people try to find the right answer, drawing on authoritative sources of information. So for instance, I don't think I know the right answer. It was very difficult, especially the question about different wages. I don't know how much these jobs pay. I read a lot about the increasing difference in wages between people working for large companies and small companies, but I don't think I remember the actual numbers correctly. So this was a survey respondent from Japan. And another quote, "Are you trying to test my intelligence?" So you can see people are trying to find the right answer about income inequality in their countries. However, when people are asked about questions that get at inequality judgment, the notable finding is that you see the use of normative language in their responses. So here is a one quote from an interviewee in Korea. "So if you're rich like those conglomerates, maybe this country is heaven. For people like me who don't have money or rich parents, it's hopeless. The society is unfair. The whole thing is distorted. It's completely unfair system." And another quote is from the United States. "I don't think income differences are large. People seem to get what they deserve." So here you can see when people judge income inequality, they interpret this based on some sort of norms and make a normative assessment. Whereas when people estimate income inequality, they try to get the correct answers about income distribution in their countries. However, but whether people estimate inequality or judge income inequality, they first need to have some understanding of the term income inequality. So do people define income inequality as academics do, or do they define income inequality differently? So how do people define income inequality? And to find out how people define income inequality in different countries, I conducted surveys with representative samples of the adult populations in France, Japan, Korea, the United States, and Indonesia. So the survey asked respondents to define income inequality and talk about income inequality in their countries in an open-ended format. So to capture the context, rather than relying on automated text analysis, I hand-coded all the answers with the help of research assistants. And these are the codes that were dominant in people's responses per country. And people in the 5 countries define and understand income inequality differently, but we observe some patterns. So in the United States and Japan, respondents explicitly or implicitly refer to poverty. So for example, poor people are getting poorer, the number of poor in the country is increasing. And on the other hand, French and Koreans wrote about how the rich are getting richer through unjust means. So to them, income inequality, they defined income inequality in terms of unfair wealth of the rich. And most of them blame the rich for increasing the gap between rich and poor. And this kind of resentment towards the rich was absent in Japan and the United States. And Americans and French also seem to equate income inequality with racial discrimination. And also nearly 70% of the respondents in Indonesia defined income inequality as religious inequality or some form of religious discrimination. And these findings suggest that people tend to define income inequality along existing cleavages in their country, along which actual income inequality or injustice have been accumulated over time. So in this regard, people are perceptive of income inequality. So now, when do people judge income inequality to be too high? And there may be many different paths, but I argue that one possible factor is sense of injustice. So people are more likely to judge that income differences are too large or unacceptable when people sense that injustice is prevalent in their countries. And here I define a sense of injustice as moral anger or indignation against injustice. So it's agitation felt about something seen, done, or said that is morally wrong or deviates from socially accepted norms. So it's about the norm of equal treatment. So does a rule apply to different people in the same way, or do different rules apply to different people? And on average, I find that people in different countries are reactive to different kinds of injustice, although injustice matters in all different countries. So to see whether people are reactive to what kind of injustice in different countries, I gave 6 hypothetical situations and asked respondents to choose the situation that they find most unfair. So then the first situation is a 1-year-old became one of the 30 richest people in the country after inheriting a lot of money from his grandparents. And the second situation is exactly same as the first one, except that this one has this clause that emphasizes deservingness by adding that a baby inherited a lot of money from his grandparents who worked hard all their lives to establish a large company. And third situation is about somebody making a lot of money from his fixed assets, which include rent from his building and money he received for selling one of his condominiums at a much higher price than what he had bought for 3 years ago. And the fourth situation is about the misbehavior of the rich. So the son of a founding president of a large corporation who's also on the list of the country's top 30 richest people, was reported to police after he demanded that a restaurant server kneel down and then hit the waiter for not serving him properly. And the fifth situation is about legal tax havens. So a recent news report stated that the super rich avoid taxes by parking their money in offshore tax havens legally. All operations are fully compliant with international law. And last situation is tax evasion, which is illegal. So a recent news report showed that the super rich avoid taxes by under-reporting their incomes and asset values, which is illegal. And here is the distribution of respondents among Japanese, Americans, Koreans, and French. And Japanese chose legal tax havens as the most unfair situation. And both Koreans and French seem to think the misbehavior of the rich as most unfair. And most Americans chose illegal tax evasion as the most unfair situation. And a notable pattern is that French and Koreans exhibit a very similar pattern. So the order of unfairness of these situations was the same for French and Koreans. And another notable finding is that Koreans care about deservingness the most. While this clause, this adding the deservingness clause, did not make any meaningful difference for Americans and Japanese, it mattered for French and Koreans, but more so for Koreans. And lastly, legality seems to matter a lot for Americans because illegal tax evasion received more votes than legal tax havens. But legality does not seem to matter in Japan, Korea, and France. More Japanese, Koreans, and French chose legal tax havens as more unfair than illegal tax evasion. And to examine whether this sort of different forms of injustice matters for how people judge income inequality, I conducted online experiment in these 4 countries in a form of randomized information treatment. So participants were randomly assigned to 5 different groups. The control group received information about baseball game, which is not related to income inequality. And the first treatment group received factual information about income inequality in their countries. And the second treatment group received information about political corruption scandals. And third treatment group received information about overseas tax havens. And the last treatment group received information about misbehavior of the rich in their countries. And the results show that the factual information about increasing inequality in their countries did not have any meaningful effect on how people judge income differences in all of the 4 countries. And while these coefficients are statistically insignificant, it's also notable that the direction is negative. And this finding is in line with existing studies that examine the effect of information on people's attitude toward inequality. And another notable finding is that the legal overseas tax haven information treatment had a meaningful effect on inequality judgment in all 4 countries, Japan, US, Korea, and France. And US Americans reacted to all 3 treatments, injustice treatments, when they were judging income inequality. And another notable finding is here again, Korea, France exhibited a lot of similarities. So both French and Koreans reacted to the legal overseas tax havens treatment and also misbehavior of the rich. And the last question, so does support for redistribution increase with income inequality judgment? And to just give you a brief background information on this redistributive puzzle in political economy. So standard models of political economy predict that demands for redistribution should increase with actual income inequality because voters would want to maximize their post-tax transfer income. And so we should expect to see this positive relationship between income inequality and support for redistribution. However, many empirical studies have shown that there is no effect or negative effect of income inequality on support for redistribution. And I argue that how people judge income inequality may help to explain this redistributive puzzle in the field of political economy. And again, here you can see Japan and Korea and France, United States in this plot. So even Japan has higher actual income inequality than Korea. The support for redistribution is lower in Japan than Korea. And again, for France and United States, even if their actual income inequality levels are similar, you see stronger support for redistribution in France than the United States. So to examine the impact of inequality judgment on redistribution, I conducted an online experiment. And here, respondents were told that they would compete against another randomly matched participant in a task and how much winners and losers will receive. And they had to solve pattern finding question for 5 minutes. So this is here because I wanted to create a setting where people get their incomes. They earn incomes based on their performance. So they don't just get random assignment of incomes, but they will earn incomes based on their performance, how they perform in this solving the pattern finding questions. And then the winners and losers were announced. But to manipulate inequality judgment, there were two conditions. So in the more unequal, people who were put in the more unequal conditions, winner received $90 and loser received $10. In the less unequal condition, winners received $60 and losers received $40. And participants in each condition was blind to the other condition. And then they answered questions about the payment and whether they thought the monetary distribution was fair, and also the differences in rewards were too large or unacceptable. And then they had this choice to give money to the other participant or take money from the other participant or do nothing. And once they choose to give or take or do nothing with the money, then how much money they decide to give to the other people or take from the other person. And this shows the judged inequality in rewards. So this shows the manipulation worked well. And in all 4 countries, you can see people judged income inequality levels were significantly higher in the more unequal condition than the less unequal condition. And what's notable is that there aren't differences across countries. So the extent of increase between the less unequal and more unequal conditions were about the same in all 4 countries. So no notable differences were observed among these 4 countries. And this is implemented income inequality after redistribution. So after people give money and take money, so the income inequality after the give or take, and this shows that, again, lower income inequality in the more unequal condition than less unequal condition, which means that more redistribution took place in the more unequal condition than the less unequal condition. And for your reference, so the redistribution is calculated as the amount of money that went from winners to losers. So when losers decided to give money to winners, that amount was calculated as negative values. So the redistribution is the amount of money that went from winners to losers. And this shows that more redistribution took place in the more unequal condition than the less unequal condition. And what's notable here is that Koreans and French were more redistributive in terms of their behavior than Japanese and Americans, as the implemented income inequality was much lower in Korea and Japan in the more unequal condition compared to Japan and United States. And I wanted to manipulate sort of a sense of injustice to see whether that has any impact on inequality judgment and people's redistributive behavior. So here the injustice treatment is that the rich gets richer and the poor continues to be poor regardless of their performance. So in order to make this distorted rule or distributive system, so this experiment proceeded in 2 steps. So that in the first round, different from the previous experiment, so people were randomly given initial wealth. So not based on any performance, they were just randomly given. So in the more unequal condition, people received $90 and $10, and in the less unequal condition, $60 and $40, and this was just done randomly. And with this initial wealth, participants went on to solve the pattern finding questions as in the previous experiment. However, so the rule was distorted, and so even if you do really, really well in the performance and you become winner in the second round, your money will not be higher as people who started with more initial wealth. So the idea is that the rule is distorted, and so the people who started with more initial wealth that was randomly given will always be getting more than those people who actually perform better in the second round. And this shows inequality judgment in rewards. And we see that with the injustice treatment, people judge that these differences in rewards are too high and not acceptable. And again, not much difference among these 4 countries. However, we see these differences in the implemented income inequality after redistribution. So we see much more redistribution took place in Korea and France compared to Japan and the United States. And to understand why people committed such behavior, thus the experiment included open-ended surveys. And what was notable was that Japanese and Koreans exhibited similarities in terms of justifying their behavior. And a desire for fairness seems to be an important driver. So for instance, one quote, "It's just unfair, even if I won, he got 3 times more than me just because he had more money in the beginning. That's totally unfair." Or the rule was the same for everyone. The other person did better than me, so that person deserves to get more. However, in France and the United States, a different kind of motivation seem to be driving their behavioral decision. So why would anyone give money to the other person when you can take money? Or it makes me feel better. So I have not fully made sense why we see these different mechanisms behind people's behavior, but I'm guessing it could be due to the cultural norms, the cultural similarities and differences among these countries, or it could be related to ethno-racial heterogeneity. So Japanese and Koreans on average are more ethnically and racially homogeneous than French and the United States, and that could be a factor leading to these differences in their motivations. So to conclude, to recap the question, so what is inequality judgment? So the answer is it's a normative assessment or interpretation of income inequality rather than factual assessment. And people define income inequality so they do not define income inequality in the way social scientists do. And they seem to define income inequality differently in different countries, which reflect different cleavages along which income inequality has been accumulated over time in those countries. And people judge income inequality to be too high or unacceptable when they sense injustice. And injustice seems to matter everywhere, but people are reactive to different forms of injustice in different countries. And I find that people support redistribution when they judge income differences to be too large or too high. But people in France and Korea seem to have more redistributive preferences than Americans and Japanese. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for the lecture. And now let's turn to the Q&A section. So you can use your Q&A function there, and I will read question out for Professor Lee. It seems that we already have a first question from Yuki Saito from the Policy Department. He asked us to go back. Can you go back to the which situation do you find most unfair slide? So he asked, with this sample size, are the differences statistically significant?
Oh, so I think for that slide, should I go answer or do you want to read more questions?
You can answer now.
Okay.
I read one.
Thank you, Yuki, for your question. So I forgot to mention the sample size, but the sample size is different from the survey that looked at the definition of income inequality. So for the question that asked about the unfair situation, it varied among countries, but the sample size was about 1,000 to 1,200 in each country. And the differences were statistically significant, but it depended on what I compare. So because French and Koreans exhibit a lot of similarities. But when I compare some countries, they were statistically significant. So some differences were meaningfully different in statistical sense, but some differences were not that meaningful. So it really depended on which I wanted to compare.
Our next question is from Siamso Bari Forgive me if I pronounce the name wrong. Hello, thank you for your great presentation. I have a question regarding the part that political parties played in influencing the people's judgment regarding the inequality. Do you see the absence or presence of particularly political parties influence inequality judgment in one country? For example, in the case of Indonesia, there has been all along been absence of leftist populism political parties since 1965. With the increase of inequality since 1998, according to the World Bank's Gini Index, the absence of leftist populist parties are complemented by rightist populist parties based on religion that play inequality issues during election and connected this issue with religious reason. This observation is also discussed by Tewitz and Lecty's article From Values to Interests 2014, although their case study are not Indonesia. It's a long question. You may need some time to digest.
So I think basically this person is asking about the role of political parties in inequality judgment. And I think political parties play a very important role because in some countries, I mean, for instance, in Japan, income inequality has not been a very salient issue in political debates or agenda compared to other countries with similar levels of actual income inequality. And I think the role of political parties is really important. So whether they take it to, sort of frame this political rhetoric and how they bring inequality as a salient issue in the realm of politics. So I think they play a very significant role. And in line with that, the role of media is really important as well, because even if income inequality is really, really low in Korea, the media has been very active in reporting income inequality issues. And together with this political rhetoric of political parties, I think that sort of created these images in Korea that they live in very unfair and unequal countries.
Okay, we have several questions from Shinobu Kitayama. First, I do not know that the relationship between perceived and actual income equality is virtually non-cross-nationally. Is this about true across different states or countries in the US? Yeonju, do you want to take all the questions or you want to answer them one by one? I can read out.
Okay, I'll go one by one.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I have not looked at the US at the state or county level, so I don't think I can give you the answer right now. But since I have the data, I'll be happy to look into the data and see whether there is any relationship at the state or county levels, or if it's as in the country level, we don't see any relationship between the two.
The next question is, you focus on income equality, although your scenario includes an inheritance component. But what does matter more in many contexts is equality or disparity in total wealth. I wonder if your analysis about the income disparity judgment might apply to wealth disparity.
Yes. So for instance, here, this is responses to the question, which inequality do you think is most serious in your country? And this is only for Japan and Korea here. And you can see that in Japan, actually, about the same, similar proportions of people answered, chose each of these different kinds of inequality as most serious. So income inequality, wealth inequality, and equality opportunities received about the similar amount of votes. Whereas in Korea, you can see a lot of people chose as wealth inequality as the most serious form. So rather than income inequality or inequality in differences. So I think although my study focuses on income inequality, I think for some countries where wealth inequality matter more, like Korea, although not in Japan. But for those countries, I think studying wealth inequality or the extent of wealth inequality might matter in the way how they judge economic inequality in general. But unfortunately, although there have been the economists trying to gather data on wealth inequality, there isn't extensive comparative sort of wealth inequality data that allow me to compare them cross-nationally. So I have a very small sample of wealth inequality data over only limited time span. But I think maybe as for my future project, it would be interesting to see how the wealth inequality play in this whole framework.
Another question is a clarification question. Did your experiment on inequality judgment and redistribution involve real money? That is, were they their incentive compatible?
Yes, so they did involve real money, but not all the participants. So they were told in the beginning of experiment, I think it was 30% or 35% of the respondents, the randomly participant respondents, will get the actual money that they are ended up with after give or take. So to give them this real incentive. So it's not just a gain, but that there is this monetary incentive for them to actually take money or give money.
The last question, it looks like you equate perceived disparity with a lack of justice. Is this link generally accepted in your field? Can you tell us how accurately people estimate objective inequality?
So because I distinguish between inequality judgment and inequality estimation, for inequality estimation, so this is one of the most widely measures that existing studies use to measure inequality estimation. So how much do you think a person with each of the following occupations earns per month before taxes? So, and what they would do is they will calculate the highest paying wage over the lowest paying wage to calculate sort of inequality estimation. Or another widely used measure is that you give there are different forms of distribution of income, and then ask people which distribution you think best fits your country. On the other hand, for inequality judgment, the survey question that I use to measure is, so to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Differences in income in your country are too large. But also I use the statements such as differences in income in your country are problematic or unacceptable. And so this is how I measure these two. And I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Okay, the next question is from Gora Liu from the Political Science Department. Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for the very informative talk. I'm intrigued by the cross-country correlation plot that motivates this project. I wonder if we remove Korea, Taiwan, and South Africa from the plot, will we see a positive correlation between perceived inequality and actual inequality? In other words, I am curious if the lack of positive correlation is driven by some outliers. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the great question. So I have done this version of plots where this correlation analysis with these outliers. So I've done ones without South Africa and also those without Korea, Taiwan, and also without South Korea, Taiwan, and South Africa. But still, I didn't see any meaningful correlation between actual income inequality and perception of income inequality, and it still holds. And also I've done it with the post-text transfer Gini, because the previous plot was the pre-transfer Gini. So even if when I use the post-text transfer Gini, still we don't see statistically or substantively meaningful relationship between the two. And here you see Japan here, South Korea, and France, and the United States. And again here, even if I take out South Africa, I see the similar result.
The next question is from John Campbell. What is your impression of change over time in the political salience of inequality in these countries? I realize you cannot answer with your survey data, but maybe you have a feel for it.
Yes, so I think that over time, the trend is really, really important. So I didn't talk about this in today's presentation, but I do look at the overtime variation historically. However, the problem is that the data that's available for measuring inequality judgment in different countries over time is somewhat limited. So the ISSB data has most sort of time and data points, but it only goes up back to 1987 or 1979, but only for a handful number of countries. And so I couldn't really trace how inequality judgment varies over time for a lot of countries, because even for these ISSB survey data, it's conducted almost every 10 years. So I don't know how it fluctuates over time. So what I do is trace this inequality judgment using sort of alternative measures historically. So I look at the media, but also some textbooks and some those memos and written works. And with that, I sort of hypothesize that, there are inequality sensitive countries and inequality insensitive countries, and people and countries that had an historical experience of equalization of income, they will have higher expectation about how income should be distributed in a later period. So once their expectations are not met, they tend to become more sensitive in the later period, whereas those who are inequality insensitive, which never really experienced the full equalization of income in their history, their expectation is low, and they will sort of remain to be low even if actual income inequality increases. But however, it's not shown here, but where you begin matters too. So, some countries have experienced inequality, even starting at like really high level, and it's been consistently high, whereas some countries, they start high, but, decrease and then go up, or some countries start low and go up, or, whether it's rapid increase or, this sort of incremental increase. I think that all matter what kind of sort of trend or pattern each country experienced over time, I think matters a lot. And people seem to be sensitive to these changes of actual income inequality. However, so I find that the countries that had sort of equalizing moment tend to be more sensitive to these changes in income inequality in a later period than those who never really experienced those experience of equality.
Thank you. Please continue to submit your questions through the Q&A function. Actually, I also have my own question. In the beginning, you mentioned that this is based on your book project. I think the book project include more things. And can you talk more about the other part of the book project? I'm particularly curious about the political implication of this subjective judgment of inequality. So you mentioned that it may have influence on political polarization, I think particularly in the US, and also democratic discontent. So I'm curious about more of this book project. So can you say more? on that
Oh,
part?
so in the book project, so the political consequences actually look at the democratic discontent and redistributive preferences that I briefly talked about, and actually voting behavior. And for democratic discontent, so people who judge, the countries with higher inequality judgment on average tend to feel more discontent about the workings of democracy. However, this discontent is stronger in stronger in younger democracies. Not younger, older democracies than younger democracies. So although I see that inequality judgment matters for democratic discontent in all countries, the effect seems to be more salient in the older democracies, such as the United States or United Kingdom or France, rather than those more younger democracies, such as Latin American countries or South Korea, Taiwan. And for voting behavior, so I look at various dimensions because I didn't just want to explain the preferences, but whether it actually has implications for people's behavior. And I examined whether it has any meaningful effect on voter turnout and also support for the leftist parties. And when people judge income differences to be unacceptable and very problematic, they tend to support leftist party or more progressive policies. And also, to my surprise, they tend to show up to elections more. So the voter turnout actually increased when in countries with higher average of inequality judgment than those without. But again, I think those are sort of some of the general findings. However, it's very important to look at the different contexts, because how that general pattern sort of played out was a little bit different in each country, and that's where the context seemed to matter. And so I did a lot of ethnography and interviews to capture those different contexts that these surveys or experiments cannot capture. And it was very interesting to see, while the pattern of inequality judgment leads to higher support for leftist party or stronger discontent, the mechanism seemed to vary across different countries. So it was different in Japan versus Korea or in other countries. But what was very interesting was that in some cases, I see more similarities between Japan and Korea, but in some cases, I saw more similarities between Japan and the United States. And I think it's to do with culture, but also formal institutions. And I'm trying to look more into sort of these different contexts and mechanisms.
Thanks again, Professor Lee, for this fantastic lecture. I guess this will be the end of today's lecture. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we are looking forward to seeing you next week. Bye.